but in terms of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And unless we can get people's hearts on fire, we have no hope here, and we don't have a prayer of getting the populace heart on fire because the seas are going to be dead. We should, but we don't. But maybe the impoverishment of their children.
An excellent point, and no, you speak to anything you want to. This is inspiring and fascinating and startling and disturbing, and I think it's a good message to get out. And I know I want to ask another question. The challenge is, how do we set our hearts on fire, our own and our families and our friends and all the world? How do we do that? It seems, you know, it's such a huge challenge. People, you said that lost the connectivity. I always characterize it as they've become desensitized. You know, we live in a world where it's okay, or it doesn't create any discord for a gentleman such as yourself to have to sit in front of the Canadian Embassy and force the issue by fasting in order to bring the question to the forefront. So how do we, as individuals, as regular people, help to set those hearts on fire?
Well, you know, several ways you've really, in this so far, you've really brought us to the point that I want to go right to, that partly addresses what you said, but I want to go right to it. I'm in the process of finishing a second book. The first one I finished about 3 weeks ago, and I haven't finalized on the title, but it's essentially Awakening the Insanely Humane Warrior in You, a Personal Trainer. And I think the subtitle will be something like the personal characteristics of the unviolent change agents throughout history, and the essential characteristics, well, without saying that, I believe that the opening essay, and both books are a series of essays, I believe that the opening essay in this second book will be about the dividing line. I don't know, I can't cite the history of when and how it happened, but I believe that I'm on firm ground. Somewhere between the late 1960s and the late 1970s, a decision among people that consider themselves activists in this country, a decision that probably was unrecognized, not understood, a decision was made. And that decision was prior, well, let's see now. So the decision made up until the 60s, the civil rights movement, some of the anti-war movement, all that, it was less clear there, was, you know what? There's some stuff that is easily worth my life. You bet your butt I'm getting on that bus. The president's agent has just in terror warned us, we students from Nashville, don't get on that bus. The first buses were just stopped in Mississippi and just barely got out with their lives. And you're getting on buses tomorrow to go back into that, you're going to get people killed. Sir, we signed our last wills last night. We understand perfectly well what we're getting into. Not too long ago, brother, in this discussion, I talked about the isolation that I've had. It's not a complaint. It's not a condemnation of anyone else. But the essence of the central characteristic of the activism that has brought dramatic change to humanity throughout history, the unviolent warfare, I think it's best called, the central characteristic of those people is exactly that they put their bodies in harm's way. They're not suicidal. They're not masochistic. They're not reckless, but they understand, how do I establish to a clinically insane populace that's not giving their daughters the right to vote? Or in Tahrir Square, one of the rare exceptions in the last 40 years, how do I explain to my brothers and sisters in Egypt, how do I show them that, you know what, we can't be human beings if we're treated like children by the most brutal dictator for 30 years now? How do I explain that except by putting my life in the way, thereby making the statement, you know what, there's something more important than my life? And that's what we saw in the women's suffrage movement with Alice Paul and the 200 sisters of hers that subjected themselves to torture in a prison 20 miles south of here in D.C., being force-fed on hunger strike, perfectly happy to die as a statement of what this was worth. Manipulating? No, an expression of what they believed. And brother, when I talked about my isolation, I embody that. To try and convince others, it's not my job to convince others. It's my job to be your brother. And if I see my family in harm's way, my body's going in between. And that is anathema. For the last 40 years, we have decided that for any of our major causes, there is nothing that we will not do to stop the horror that's being unleashed by the corporate world and the right. As long as we can do it from behind our computer screens. As long as it's not going to cost long prison terms. As long as it's not going to get anyone killed. Well, you know what? Women would not be voting today if that had been the decision of the women's suffragists back in 2018. And you know what? We would not have civil rights if that had been the view of the Freedom Riders. So we have totally disarmed ourselves. There are two ways, and two ways only if one looks at history. There are two ways of bringing radical change to an otherwise clinically insane, destructive society. One way is to show up with enough guns that you can convince them, I am going to kill you unless you give me what I want. And the other way is to show up in the perfect and powerful form of unviolent warfare and say, we are not here to cause trouble. We are simply here to collect what is rightfully ours. A seat in that bus terminal in what's called a whites-only waiting room. Or the right of my daughter to vote, who is one of God's children and by every measure should have the right to vote. We are simply here to collect what is rightfully ours, and if the price is our lives, we will happily pay it. Now maybe someone can explain to me that that is not the form of what happened in India. That is not the form of the nonviolence in South Africa. But I've studied this pretty well, and I don't feel clever in saying it. And for the last 40 years, if you want to clear a room of activists, you talk about putting your body in the way and be willing to die until you get what is rightfully yours. You talk about taking personal responsibility, not for acting against it, but for actually stopping it. And if you want to clear a room, you do that. And if you want to be sure you're not talked to again, you do that. We don't take responsibility for fixing it anymore. We do what we want, when we want, what feels good, and then when it doesn't happen, we blame the powers that be. Well, fine, except, friend, we're out of time. If we lose life support on planet Earth, which is a virtual certainty, unless this year or at the latest next year, we start reducing emissions 6%. You know, Einstein said 60 years ago, he said, I don't know what weapons World War III is going to be fought with, but I know what the weapons of World War IV are going to be. They're going to be sticks and stones. Well, I know what the weapons of World War III are. Our reckless, needless burning of warming gas emission fuels for the last 30 years. We have 8 times more wind and 200 times more sun in this country than we need to replace every lump of coal, every drop of oil, and it's at grid parity already. But none of us care enough to stand up and put our bodies in the way of the 20 to 80 trillion dollars in fossil fuel reserves that the largest industry on the planet, the fossil fuel industry, will spend every $1 million a day that they have to keep us on the sidelines. That's crazy, man. You know, I wish I had a nickel for everyone that said, Loving, don't die for this. And I'm saying to myself, what? We're about to irrevocably condemn the next 2,000 generations to living hell. And someone would question that I'm willing to die to stop that? What kind of madness is this? What kind of creatures have we turned into? My brothers and sisters all, but I don't get it. I do get that I didn't get it for most of my adulthood, but now that I get it, I don't get it anymore.
That was such a wonderful exposition and a call to action. I don't feel worthy to be conducting this interview. That was so well stated.
My brother, we all do the best we can, but the bottom line is, someone better frickin' figure out for themselves that my assessment of the successful, unviolent warfare, including what we just saw in Tahrir Square a year and a half ago, and I watched I watched and re-uploaded to my YouTube channel, republished every bit of news that was published on that during the whole thing. And these guys were real clear, the Wild Goneems and other leaders. So, guys, you're 3 days into this. Do you think you're going to win? We are not going to win. This guy has a 200,000-man torture force whose job is to kill us, to imprison us, to torture us into submission. We do not expect to win. But we are not going to sit down anymore. And it shocked the conscience of the world. It established, as words never could have, this is worth our lives to stop. And that hacks through our dead, insensitive nervous systems to our almost dead hearts and pulls them enough that we call our governments and we say, you've got to come alongside these guys. You cannot let them be stopped. Is it a surefire? There's no surefire. Is it the strongest weapon known to man? Well, when Gandhi mobilized forces, hundreds and thousands of people who agreed, we are going to march on a salt works that has harvested the salt from our ocean by the British, and they are selling it to us with a tax. That's not okay. That's not right. We're going to show up and we're going to say, we are here to collect what is rightfully ours, the salt from our oceans. We are not here to cause trouble, but we are going to march on this salt works, and if the price is our lives, we will happily pay it. I'm not saying those are the words. I'm saying that's the obvious form of what they did. And they had previously sworn, we're going to be clubbed. We will not raise our hands to block the clubs. We will not raise our hand to protect ourselves. Once the perpetrators, once the folks with the clubs got sufficiently frustrated, when the bodies were on the ground, they would target their groins with their feet, and they would violently kick them in the groins. The protesters refused to cover their groins. This was covered by the New York Times and otherwise. And it was done. It shocked the conscience of the world. Brother, we have disarmed ourselves for the last 40 years of personal responsibility, of a decision. We're not playing to play. We're not playing to feel good. We have selected a cause that is worth our lives. And by God, why the hell wouldn't we why is there nothing that's so important that we wouldn't happily give our lives for it? We have been disarmed for 40 years, and we wonder why we haven't achieved anything except for failure and forming our activist clubs and being nice to each other. And fine, I don't go interfere with people, but it's a circle jerk, and soon, if it's not done, every person that is young or has a child or a grandchild, the ones that survive for the next 2,000 generations are not going to think they were the lucky ones. And if that's not worth your life, and if that's not worth my life, and anyone listening, then someone needs to explain it to me, and more importantly, they need to explain it to the person when they get up in the morning. Because if that's true, we are no longer a viable species, and the horror is we perpetrators, through our cowardly inaction, are not the ones that are going to pay the major price. It's every young person today, and it's every child ever born on Earth. They're the ones that are going to be ground up by our Mother Earth. And God, guys, that's not worth our lives? The bottom line of this campaign, brother, this is EM equals MC squared. I've never understood the formula, but a macrophysicist does, and they can do stuff with it. I never expected to see how to stop environmental Armageddon. And brother, no one has even asked that question. I've done nothing but study this for 4 years. They won't even entertain the question. What can we do? What march can we have? Let's have 4-hour posts and forfeits. But actually say, what do we have to do to stop it? It empties the room. And I can't think about anything else, but I never expected to see the answer. And about 8 weeks ago, it was there when I woke up in the morning. In these two forms. The first part was, I had just seen the documentary, the CBC documentary. It's called Tipping Point. If one Googles Tracking Plan B, the letter B, my blog by that name comes up, and right in the middle of it is a link to an 1.5-hour video that I put up on one of my YouTube sites. It's a CBC documentary. The whole team must have been fired because it was such an expose on the tar sands. It was incredibly heroic and beautifully done. And it showed me two things that I hadn't realized. Canada is expecting, well, actually, I'm going to say it this way, because if we have any listeners here.
Oh, we have plenty. You keep going.
So if we have any listeners, despite studying nothing but this stuff for 4 years, 7 days a week, every waking second, no, not almost every waking second, every waking second, I had no idea of this. So I'm gonna pose a question to you. How much money is Canada expecting to get out of their tar sands? And I'm going to give you just a second to pause and see if you can guess. I had never guessed at the question. I didn't have a clue. Which is a shame to all the thought leaders in this area, because this is just fricking dynamite. It's the whole situation analysis in a nutshell. The answer is Canada is expecting to get between 1.7 and $2 trillion out of the tar sands. Now, people can be driven crazy to the point of murder for $100, for $1,000, for $10,000 in the right situation, right?
Right.
$2 trillion can drive people really, 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 really crazy. Now, the tar sands represent, my rough estimate, 3% of the fossil fuel reserves currently on the planet. If we let any more of those things out of the ground, if we don't start bending it down 6% a year, it's game over. The tundra is going to melt, releasing the thermal equivalent of about 30 million Hiroshima-class nuclear bombs into the atmosphere every day. That's how much warming. An order of magnitude greater than's currently up there, warming in a degree and a half. It's game over. But for $1.5 trillion, see, the other thing the tipping point showed, some of you guys know the name James Cameron. He was the money and the brains behind the movie Avatar and others. Right. James Cameron had a cameo in this, and I think is trying to republish it in the States because it's so powerful. Whether it was their purpose or not, I don't know, but it centered around a town on Lake Athabasca, which is right on the tributary, the river that feeds, that is fed from the upstream tar sands works. The cancer rates are 4 or 5 times the national population for cancer rates. And during the course of this, you see the family doctor seeing that the town doctor, seeing that with the national healthcare system, seeing that the cancer rates are going up dramatically. Beginning to appropriately, this is a mild-mannered man, feed this information back to the national healthcare system. The national healthcare sends in a team They literally go over to the faucet, grab a mug of water, drink a mug of water, and say, "You don't have a problem," and the family doctor gets fired. This is gross insanity. This is gross inhumanity. I don't know if you're understanding based on my synopsis. This documentary is an absolute must-see. It's not some nasty Michael Moore expose. It's very professionally done, but the insanity that $1.7 trillion in expected revenue can drive people to, and I had never heard anyone talk about the financial value of the fossil reserves that are at issue here. My rough estimate is $40 trillion. How hard do we think that the coal and gas industry is going to fight any sane legislation? Do we really think that anything less than enough people seen dying for it is going to wake up enough of our fellow citizens to say, what's going on here? To cut through the $1 million plus a day that's being spent to keep us on the sidelines? Do we really think that anything less than 1,000 people showing up in front of the Canadian Embassy saying, we're simply here to collect what's rightfully ours? You pay the wreckage costs on your fuel, right? So the wreckage costs have been easily calculated. If I spend $1 on gasoline, the wreckage costs are $4 in terms of fortifying our cities, for example, against the sea level rise. Mm-hmm. Are we really going to let New York City go under 6 feet of water? We're not. Our children are going to spend all of their discretionary income on trying to pay to fortify it and the rest of our cities. So the demand here is not to stop tar sands, is not to stop coal, is not to stop oil. It is you pay your wreckage costs. If you smoke today, your health care costs are going to be huge. I don't want you to smoke. I don't want you to die. I don't have the right to tell you not to smoke. I do have the right to tell you I'm not paying your health care costs. You're going to. And that has two effects. It takes your health care costs off of me, and it increases by $2 to $3 a pack your cost of cigarettes. And guess what? Your use of cigarettes goes down. Mm-hmm. So the demand here, which was not figured out by me, it was figured out by a team of economists, and it's best expressed by Jim Hansen, the only hero here, the NASA scientist, who's been the leading edge on the science here. He's now proposing what's called fee and dividend. Every year, we will simply begin to add the wreckage fee so it's paid by the consumers of coal and tar sands and oil instead of plug-in hybrids and wind and solar energy. That's the demand here. You pay your wreckage costs. Now, when that legislation is announced, guess what just happened to the value of the tar sands? It went down by 75%. Guess what just happened to the value of a new coal-fired power plant? It just went down the toilet. It makes no sense to do that when today wind power, your coal-fired electricity, and that's probably what you're getting in North Carolina, is about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Guess what wind generated electricity coming out of that same wall socket would cost you? About 7 cents a kilowatt hour. But we are so lethargic, honey, I don't have time to worry about where our energy is coming from. But the second that this legislation is announced, where over 10 years, the real cost, including the 4 times wreckage cost of your coal and oil and tar sands, are going to start coming on your bill. Honey, you remember that little box on our energy bill where we could check to get wind-powered electricity instead of coal-powered electricity? I think we ought to check that box. You remember the new car we were going to buy, honey? 10 years from now, oil's going to be, our gas is going to be $15 a gallon. And I just read that today a plug-in hybrid running off of wind power is the equivalent of $1 a gallon of gasoline. Honey, I think we're going to get a plug-in hybrid this time. So we just killed the whole Earth-killing meteor. Now, the insanity of my brothers and sisters in the environmental movement is, what are they trying to kill? The tar sands, the Keystone Pipeline. That has all the sanity as if you and I saw that there was an Earth-killing meteor hurtling toward Earth that was going to destroy all life on Earth, and you and I had the bright idea, well, it'd be awfully hard to stop the whole meteor. Let's destroy 3% of it. Kind of insane, wouldn't it be?
Yep, it's a really good point, and it's one we talk about frequently, is the ability to address the root causes.